Happy Saturday. It's January 25th, 2025, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in New York.
And I'm Michael Haney, also in New York City.
And a new era has dawned in American politics. Once again, Donald Trump is back in office, as if we could ever forget. What a week it's been, Michael.
It's been a historic, dramatic, fast-paced week, of course, coming out of D.C.
Did you watch the inauguration?
I watched out of the corner of my eye, dipping in at different moments. So despite what I think of everything, I'm a fan of history and ceremony, so I wanted to see all that. So it was, on a visual level, multi-layered, let's just say that.
Michael, we're journalists. We've got to watch this stuff. We can't look away. I mean, I've never seen so many grouchy-looking people in the rotunda. I mean, the January 6th rioters were positively gleeful compared with that crowd.
I've never seen three Arnauds in the rotunda.
It was wild. It's like everyone's terrified of the tariffs. I don't know. The fashion choices were interesting to me. You know, the way that they looked, kind of this, it was sort of like a bizarre retro throwback to the 60s, you know, like Audrey Hepburn nods and sort of Jackie Kennedy nods on Ivanka Trump, et cetera. But I don't know. I found Melania's clothing to be so angry. Alessandra and I were talking about this last night. You know, we were trying to figure out like the whole hat, like the buttoned up look. The whole thing, it was just such a bizarre parade and spectacle. And once again, you know, it's going to be a depressing 4 years of reading the headlines, but that is our job and we shall do it. And we are going to make sense of it here, Michael, at Airmail.
Absolutely. And as you note, it's been a chaotic week from the White House with executive orders flying fast and furious. Disenchantment with diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI was a boon for Donald Trump. But the question now is, will his crusade against wokeness go too far for recent MAGA converts? And our writer, David Christopher Kaufman, is going to tell us why Trump's first shot in the war on woke could well backfire. Then, it was a cold-blooded murder that shocked the country when Luigi Mangione allegedly gunned down Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare in New York City last month. Thompson's death revealed a simmering rage towards the insurance industry, and Bethany McLean will join us with her perspective on the case that's riveted the country. Then, if this week has left you feeling like you need a good, strong drink, Nick Terse has his suggestion for you. Try some Peppy Van Winkle bourbon, maybe, if you can find it. He'll tell us why a shot of it costs $300 and bottles trade for $100,000 on the black market. But Ashley, I think I know where you want to begin today, probably with David Kaufman and his report on DEI and Trump. Am I right?
David Kaufman is here to explain what exactly all of this conversation around DEI means anyway. He is an editor and columnist at the New York Post, as well as an opinion writer for The Telegraph and an adjunct fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
So, David, Donald Trump has been vocal about his disenchantment with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging legislation. Where did that all come from, and how did it serve him in the election?
It was very much sort of a warning sign for Donald Trump and sort of evocative of his idea that woke culture has overtaken America and sort of eroded its core values. He really promised during the election to roll back all kinds of DEI and race-based preference programs, and he's made good on those promises. In his first day in office, he began the dismantling of DEI by issuing executive orders that remove such protections from many federal workers. And this is probably only just the beginning of his, what I call, war on woke.
It seems that some subsets of corporate America have already fallen into line, right? As well as educational institutions like Harvard and the University of Michigan. How do they plan to scale back or even end this DEI programming?
It's important to note that there was already disenchantment with DEI, before Trump assumed office. I think that the rank and file of America had begun to see the holes in this identity politics project, and there was pressure to pull back. So McDonald's and Facebook and Walmart, other big companies began to say that we're not necessarily going to prioritize DEI programs in our corporate philosophies, or if they were sneaky, they began to rebrand them with other kinds of clever language. I mean, you also saw at Harvard and other universities are now saying that they're not going to require DEI statements from their potential applicants. And this is really, I think, a necessary, in some ways quite necessary in the sense that, especially at universities, you have the emergence over the past few years of this bloated DEI bureaucracy that's costing these universities tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to fund administrators and programs and initiatives to promote DEI, to promote equity. And it's one of the most interesting things about DEI is that there really aren't benchmarks for its success. Like, we don't really know if DEI works. We know that they're saying that we have X or Y increase in X or Y representation in X or Y element of a university. But in the long run, there isn't really a standard for what is a success. So you have these universities spending tens of millions of dollars. In some cases, you have universities that have more administrators, more bureaucrats than actual professors, but no real sense that anything is actually coming from this. We liked one interesting thing about academia is that they tend to rank the success of diversity initiatives by the number of incoming freshmen. So we have X percentage of African American incoming freshmen in X year compared to B year or Y year. What they don't factor in is how many of those Black students are actually graduating in 4 years. It doesn't matter if a Black kid gets into Harvard. What we want is a Black kid to graduate from Harvard. This Black kid who might be brought into a university under a DEI initiative, if they don't graduate, they could actually be in a worse situation because they're saddled with tens of thousands of dollars of student debt. What I think Donald Trump is saying, what a lot of other folks are saying on the right, is that not only is DEI, or they perceive it as being unfair, but they don't really perceive it as being particularly effective, and there's no real standard for measuring its effectiveness.
David, a lot is being said of the quote unquote rainbow coalition that helped to elect Donald Trump. He's certainly using whatever math he has configured to equate to quote a landslide victory as a broad mandate to, enact sort of legislation and advance his agenda. But as you remind us, his support among that rainbow coalition might be more precarious than he's letting on. Explain that a bit.
Trump was extremely successful in luring voters who had traditionally fallen under the Democrats. He got record numbers of African Americans, especially Black men, also record numbers of Latins, and a surprisingly large number of women, a boost in female voters, considering the outsized role that abortion played in the election. So Donald Trump really expanded his base. We think of the Trump base as being kind of white guys in sort of rural or less economically developed areas. But instead, this election demonstrated that he had broad appeal to minorities. Donald Trump's landslide was an electoral college landslide. It wasn't a popular vote landslide. He did win the popular vote, but he won it by 1.5%. What that means is all of those Black folks and Latin folks and women who flocked to vote for Donald Trump in November, those votes mattered. Those are the votes that helped him get over that hurdle and win the popular vote by the slim majority. What that means is that Donald Trump wants these folks to vote for him again, not necessarily him because he won't run again, but say Trumpism or J.D. Vance or Donald Trump Jr., whoever will assume the mantle place of Trumpism in the next election. If he wants to win the next election, he needs to keep these minority voters and female voters on his side. The challenge is by rolling back and attacking DEI, the folks who will be most impacted directly and immediately by these executive orders are the exact same people who flocked to Donald Trump for the first time ever. If you roll back race-based preferences, you hurt African Americans, you hurt Latinos, you possibly hurt women. You can see this already with LGBT voters. With the previous 2 election cycles with Trump, gay and lesbian voters, the voter numbers surged for Trump. Trump got more and more gay and lesbian votes in the last 2 cycles than he did than any other Democratic candidate. In this time, we saw an erosion of LGBT votes, which suggests that gay and lesbians and transgenders are understanding that Trump might not necessarily be their friend. And this feeling of disaffection for Trump and for Trumpism and for the Republicans could trickle down to other minorities like Blacks and Latins and women if they begin to feel that his attack on DEI is overreaching and is alienating. As I note in the piece, while there is a legitimate and understandable need to reassess and re-engage with DEI, at the same time, the structural issues that have encouraged DEI in the first place, racism, economic inequality, homophobia, transphobia, these things are very real. And Trump and his team are not really acknowledging that side as well. So if we see Trump, really begin to overreach, if it's not just about rolling back, say, transgender issues, but he starts to attack marriage equality, then we could see a big backlash by this rainbow coalition who flocked to Trump.
Is there a middle ground on this? That if you were looking at it with Trump?
Yeah, if I was in the Oval with Trump and co, yes, of course there is a middle ground. I mean, I think number one, it's the optics and even the language around Trump there's a lot of room for improvement. I mean, Trump is a very interesting character because on one level, when you see him engaging, say, with families who've lost sons and daughters in war, soldiers, you do see this real sense of compassion in him. Like you feel like he's a father who can identify with parents who've lost a child. So it's not that Trump lacks compassion necessarily. I don't believe he's as sort of craven and sort of diabolical as people make him out to be. But when it comes to issues, and we saw this in the church service where the reverend in the church service asked him to show kindness towards transgender people. What's missing from Trump's language around DEI and race-based preferences and this sort of moment of woke is any sense that he understands why these things exist in the first place. You can say DEI has gone too far. DEI is penalizing people. DEI has failed. DEI universities has failed Jewish students in this period of intense anti-Semitism. Trump could also say, I acknowledge that the country has a legacy of racism. I acknowledge that the country has a legacy of gender inequality. I acknowledge that transgender young people, while I might not necessarily agree with some of the medical-based solutions, I acknowledge that transgender young people face intense discrimination and intense personal challenges. He could use that language of compassion to balance, what could be perceived as very extremist immediate actions in his first few days in the White House.
David, did you watch the inauguration?
I watched parts of it, and I had the kids home on Monday because it was MLK Day. So I was balancing the kids and watching Donald, and of course watching Lauren Sanchez and her interesting choice of inauguration fashion.
I mean, it's the first time that we've seen like the boning on a bustier in the rotunda, but I suspect it won't be the last in this administration.
I think she'll be back.
So what was going through your head when you saw Trump making all of these, dare I say, absurd and ridiculous proclamations, not only about DEI, but about all sorts of other issues? I mean, how serious are we supposed to take this stuff?
I think we should take it very seriously. I mean, I had a very brief and mildly intense friendship with the first lady of a small European nation a few years back during my previous job at Condé Nast. And this woman had said, this first lady who I met for coffee a few times had said to me that she, with her husband, who is a leader of a small European nation, had been to the White House twice during Trump won. And she said to me the first time she was there, things were a little bit kind of chaotic, that he didn't really know what he was doing. But by the end, the man knew what he was doing. He was on the ball. He had figured it out. He was a quick study and a quick learner. And she said to me, if he gets back in office, you folks better be ready. You people need to take this seriously. So I'm taking him very seriously. This period between the election and inauguration, I think the nation was in sort of like a national period of denial. Like they weren't really acknowledging that this guy was about to be in office. I mean, and he was making very clear what he was going to do. There's nothing surprising about what's happening or what will happen with Trump. He's made it very clear. And also he was very clever to use the phrase common sense at the inauguration. He framed all of his actions in the narrative of restoring common sense to the White House, to Washington, to government. And, that's a very hard argument to argue with. People like common sense. And there's been a feeling that many of the identity war and the sort of woke actions of the left have just lacked common sense. So by embracing that phrase, he really sort of set up a framework where his agenda can be pushed through, branded as, common sense, how things are supposed to be, how things have always been. And he can sort of frame the progressives and the Democrats as the ones who've been out of touch, not necessarily him and his people.
Well, David, it's going to be an interesting 4 years. God help us all. Thank you so much for making sense of this for us. And we look forward to speaking with you again. I have a feeling we're going to have a lot to talk about.
This roller coaster has only just begun. Thank you.
Well, it's just another way in which it feels like we're going back in time in this Trump presidency, Michael. Here we go again.
Well, you always have to remind yourself that it's a TV show and a new storyline's got to drop every day to keep you engaged. Yeah, it's going to be a bumpy ride, and I'm sure we're going to watch this unfold from the White House and the courts as well. So let's see where it takes us.
Well, all right, Michael, I already feel like I need to refill my Xanax prescription if I'm going to make it through this week. Let's bring on Bethany McLean to talk about another tragedy that has happened on American soil in recent months, which is the murder of United Healthcare executive Brian Thompson. As Bethany reports in her story this week, the practices behind the insurance agencies in the United States are not exactly unusual, and why we should be paying more attention to what exactly is going on there. Bethany is a journalist and the author of several books, including The Smartest Guys in the Room, The Amazing Rise and Scandalous Fall of Enron. Her most recent one is The Big Fall, What the Pandemic Revealed About Who America Protects and Who It Leaves Behind. Welcome, Bethany.
Thanks for having me.
So, Bethany, the story that we were all completely transfixed by was the murder of United Healthcare executive Brian Thompson. But you helped make sense of it in the issue of Airmail this week by talking about the profit motives behind an executive like Thompson and a company like United Healthcare. So what is this profit for all mentality? Where did it come from?
Well, I think it's always been there. Obviously, a corporation exists to produce profits, but we began to oversimplify at some point in the last bunch of decades. And the intellectual underpinning for this was a famous essay by an economist, a Nobel Prize-winning economist named Milton Friedman. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that argued that the main purpose of a corporation was to produce profits. And it became a way for people to say all other interests should be put to the side, because the main purpose of a corporation is to produce profits, and we shouldn't worry about other stakeholders. But, it's a little bit of a fallacy that this was entirely Friedman's doing, because if that had been the case, it would have happened right away. What really happened is that in the 1980s, as activists got involved in companies and began to push out management teams they saw as underperforming, management teams became very intent on saving their own jobs. And good financial performance became a bulwark against losing one's job.
But as you note in your story, you say we've got a system in which everyone, from executives to shareholders, is at least guilty or plays a part in this. But what I found most enlightening was you said it's actually kind of absurd because no one even knows whether this pay for performance even works, right? And we've had like 40 years where it's like, greed is good, get the bottom line. If you don't, you're going to get fired, the board's going to turn you over, and the board's going to be voted out. But you say that it doesn't really have any evidence, right?
Well, I was struck by this when I was researching this piece because I found a lot of studies questioning whether it works, and then you can find other studies saying that it does work. Basically, in anything like this that is supposedly a quantitative exercise, you can manipulate the outcome by choosing a particular time period or choosing which companies you look at or weighting things differently. And so essentially you can arrive at any answer you want to show whether it works or whether it doesn't work, which to my mind is enough of a question that we should just say, does this work? And, people have been trying for a while. There was this famous thing that happened, it was pre-pandemic, where the Business Roundtable, the big organization of companies, came out and said, well, we should be focused on stakeholder value, meaning value for everybody who's a participant in a company, employees and customers and communities, not just the bottom line. But the reality is this executive compensation is so entrenched in the system that it's really hard to see how this idea of stakeholder capitalism, which has made any difference.
And Bethany, why has the insurance industry been on the receiving end of so much criticism over their adoption of what many other industries would consider to be non-controversial?
Yeah, in some ways it's unfair, and it's a broader symptom of our problems with healthcare in the United States, because the insurance industry is in the position where they are supposed to manage healthcare costs by denying claims. And the reality is that sounds okay until you're somebody whose claim for something you desperately need is denied. And then when you see how much executives are getting paid, it just feels like a abdication of a basic human decency. But the reality is the insurance industry is no worse, and perhaps maybe even in some ways better than some other industries. What I think the anger shows is just this is becoming untenable for our society. Both the gap between what executives are paid and what other people are paid, in the sense that profits are all that matters to a corporation. It just doesn't work anymore. There's so many examples of how it doesn't work anymore for our broader society. And in the end, corporations are part of the broader world. And if that broader world is in a state of upheaval, then that's for sure not going to produce shareholder value.
But Bethany, as you report, Brian Thompson's compensation in 2023 was $10.2 million, which really doesn't seem disproportionate to the earnings of the company, right?
No, it really isn't. And the profit margins of United Healthcare are not so great compared to the profit margins of other companies. You can argue in a way that Brian Thompson is sort of a misplaced tragic character in this whole broader script, both because his compensation isn't so enormous and because what United Healthcare does is not as evil as, for example, what the opioid manufacturers did or what the companies that enabled opioids to be distributed all over the country did. To me, it shows just the broader anger out there, the simmering rage about all of this.
Bethany, one of the things you touch on in your story as well is, I mean, yes, it's specific to the healthcare system, but it's really about capitalism right now. Even if you look at Mangione, like referencing Ted Kaczynski's manifesto and different things, and you end sort of referencing, that famous line from F. Scott Fitzgerald, and maybe the system, the whole capitalist system needs to reform itself about profits and can be run a profitable company and do the right thing. So tell us about what you're thinking there.
Yeah, I do still believe in capitalism. I think to paraphrase another famous quote, it's like Winston Churchill's argument, democracy is the worst possible system with the possible exception of everything else that has ever been tried. And I think you could say the same thing about capitalism, but I think we've allowed the capitalist mentality to infiltrate areas where it shouldn't be. And anything, when taken to an extreme, starts to result in bad outcomes. I don't see anything wrong with the profit motive throughout many businesses, but the profit motive shouldn't and can't exist everywhere. It's in conflict with basic human decency in healthcare, where profits mean sometimes denying someone care or pushing to make money at the expense of somebody's life in the hospital industry. And I do think CEOs, executives in general, that's why I use that F. Scott Fitzgerald quote about the true mark of genius. I'm butchering it, but the true mark of genius is to hold two competing notions in your mind and not go crazy. And if our executives are being paid like they are geniuses, then they should be able to manifest genius in their work and care about profits. Yes, that's the mark of a successful business. That's what enables workers to be paid. That's what enables a company to continue to exist. But they should be able to not care about profits when it's not the right thing to do.
Well, Bethany, thank you so much for making sense of all of this for us and for your incredible analysis. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Bethany. Well, Ashley, I know you said earlier you wanted Xanax, maybe, but Nick Terse has his story now on Pappy Van Winkle, perhaps the most sought-after Kentucky bourbon in the world. Nick is an American investigative journalist, historian, and author. He's the associate editor and research director of the blog Tom Dispatch and a fellow at the Nation Institute.
All right, welcome, Nick.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, Nick, I have to start this off with a personal story. I got married in the South about, 15 years ago. And at our wedding, the house bourbon was Pappy Van Winkle, which is absolutely astounding now, given how incredibly expensive it is. But how did it get there? Like within the course of 15 years, let's say, like how did it become sort of the ne plus ultra of spirits?
Yeah, well, it really began in the late 90s. It was 1996. The 20-year expression of Pappy Van Winkle received a 99 rating from the Beverage Tasting Institute. And that was the highest rating it had ever given. From that moment on, it seems like it went from a bourbon that you could find on liquor store shelves at a reasonable price, one that you might, find at a wedding, but to one that is impossible to find and financially out of the reach of most bourbon drinkers.
So take us through, how is it made and what makes it so special? I mean, why can't they just produce bigger quantities of it?
Well, I think that, part of the allure of it is that, it's a small batch bourbon and, it's made like many of the other Buffalo Trace brand bourbons. It's a wheated bourbon, meaning that, aside from the corn in it, the next purchase grain, unlike other bourbons where it's rye, is wheat. And there are other Buffalo Trace bourbons like that. They're Weller brand. But the Van Winkle family, Julian Van Winkle III, and now Preston Van Winkle, who's fourth generation bourbon maestro of the family, they select from all the Buffalo Trace barrels and find the what's known as the honey barrels, the best barrels. They select those, and those are the barrels that become Pappy Van Winkle. So these are the best of the best that Buffalo Trace produces.
And Nick, because things are so good, of course, the price, it's gotten exorbitant. And tell us, first of all, how much it goes for these days and the demand for it. And also, it seems to create criminal tendencies among people as well, right?
That's right. Even the marquee expression, as it's known, is a 23-year Pappy Van Winkle. That's the oldest. It's aged the longest in the barrels, 23 years. But even the others, the old Rip Van Winkle 10-year, the Pappy Van Winkle 15-year, the Pappy Van Winkle 20-year, these all, while the manufacturers suggest a retail price is somewhere in the hundreds, if you could find them on a shelf, you're going to pay thousands of dollars, around $5,000 a bottle. But, the most coveted bottles at auction can cost upwards of $50,000 for the 23 year. And a single shot, at a bar, if you can find it, might set you back $200, $300. There's also a very good chance that the shot that you buy won't really be Pappy. There's a lot of bogus booze out there, and Pappy is often at the center of it. I mean, counterfeit Pappy is now a persistent problem. When I was talking to Preston, he said that this is something that he and the Buffalo Trace Distillery are trying to fight in various ways, using various security mechanisms to try to eliminate this. But, if you go on eBay or, other sites online, you can find empty bottles of Pappy being sold. And then these are routinely filled up with all manner of rot gut and resealed and offered again elsewhere for thousands of dollars on the secondary market. You talked about the illegality. Beyond that, there were dozens of bottles worth as much as $100,000 on the black market that up and vanished during something that became known as Pappygate. It was an inside job bourbon heist during the 2010s, which in the last couple of years showed up on a Netflix documentary called Heist. Pappy has also been at the center of allegations of impropriety at state liquor regulating agencies from coast to coast, Pennsylvania, Oregon, Kentucky, Virginia. They've all had scandals in the last few years with allegations that those on the liquor boards were allocating bottles or tipping people off to where they would be and receiving kickbacks. It's so sought after that, it just encourages so much criminality.
So, Nick, you were fortunate enough to attend a tasting of Pappy. I mean, what makes this stuff so superlative?
It's tough to put your finger on it. During this, it was a dinner pairing with the Rip Van Winkle 10-year, the Pappy 15, 20, and 23 year. And, they were exceptionally good bourbons, very smooth, not a lot of burn or bite to them that you find in bourbons that aren't aged for a very long time. I had never tried the 23 year before. Actually, I had been warned by people who had it before that it was in the barrel so long that it was exceptionally oaky, that the oak flavor that it pulled from the barrels just overwhelmed everything else. But I found that actually it was, an exceptional and singular taste profile.
But Nick, you talk about criminal tendencies among people, and one thing I thought was so revealing in your story is there's a lot of snobs in this world and how they want to drink it, how you should drink it. Seems you got first-hand sort of recommendation on you can drink it beyond just drinking it neat, right?
Preston Van Winkle, who was the fourth generation of the Van Winkle family involved in the bourbon business. He told a story about going to a bar in Breckenridge, Colorado. And he saw there was a bottle of 10-year old Rip at the bar. He ordered it on the rocks with a splash and a twist. And the bartender told him, that he couldn't serve it to him that way, that Pappy Van Winkle would roll over in his grave if he did so. So the bartender said, I can give you the water, I can give you the ice, I can give you the lemon twist, and you can doctor it up if that's how you want it. So Preston said, sure. He brought over the fixings for it, and Preston made it up himself. Later, he gave the bartender his credit card to settle up, and he walked over to the credit card machine, and the bartender froze, and he called his manager over. Preston watched the manager shaking his head, and the bartender sort of slunk back and said, I'm very sorry, Mr. Van Winkle. And, Preston told him, there are a lot of people who have a lot of misconceptions about Pappy Van Winkle and how it should be drunk. But he said, this is how Pappy liked it, and how Pappy drank it, and how his grandfather, Julian Van Winkle II, drank it, how Julian III drank it, and this is how Preston drinks it. He recommended the bartender that he try it that way.
It seems, especially like this time that we live in, is there any sort of anti-Pappy backlash? Do people feel like this has just gotten completely out of control?
You find that, people in the bourbon drinking and sampling community, I think over the last few years, there has been a tendency of people to give it some poor ratings out there, say that it's overrated, that it's overpriced, that no one should be paying, this much for a bourbon. And, on some level, I think they're probably right. Certainly, Preston Van Winkle thought that they were right. He didn't think that it should be sold on the secondary market at these exorbitant prices. But, he said they're really sort of powerless to, to combat that in any real way, except that what he and also an executive from Sazerac, which owns Buffalo Trace, mentioned is that during this bourbon boom of the last 20 years, they'd been building a tremendous number of barrel houses. So they have many more barrels now aging. It takes the lowest level Van Winkle expression is 10 years, but both of them said there are more barrels on the way, quite a bit more. That should bring down the price quite a bit going forward in the years and decades ahead. That the supply will, hopefully finally catch up with the demand.
It's like the Taylor Swift of bourbon.
That's a good way to put it.
Well, Nick, thank you so much for this incredible hardship assignment that you've undertaken on our behalf. We're so sorry that you had to suffer through this, and we hope that the aftermath was not too severe. Thanks again for that and for the story, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
My pleasure. Anytime.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report, our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it, is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
Michael, this is another one of those stories I feel like we should be casting. Like who's going to play Luigi Mangione? Who's going to play Brian Thompson? I bet you already have some ideas.
How about Justin Baldoni as Luigi Mangione?
Ooh, perfect transition, Michael, into our next conversation, which is our recommended section of our podcast. But I have to talk to you about It Ends With Us. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it. Tell me everything I need to know.
Okay, Blake, Justin, you win. Okay, I watched the movie. I was flying back to New York. It was on the plane. I suffered through it. I mean, the way that they have been talking about this film in the press, you would think that we were talking about a Bergman film. But no, I have seen better movies than this on the Hallmark Channel. It is appalling.
That's the summation?
I think the writing is pretty clumsy. I think the storyline, I'm sorry to say it, I think the storyline is a little bit cheesy. I don't know whose side I'm on. I think they're both losers in this game. But after watching the movie, I kind of empathized just a bit with Baldoni because, one of the points of contention was that Blake Lively wanted control over the costumes that her character wears. And oh my God, these are terrible costumes. I was like, what is going on here? It's like a bad 1980s version of Rayanne Graff from My So-Called Life. So I kind of see where he's coming from. I mean, they both seem to me kind of hateable in this movie, I'm sorry to say. But if all of this legislation has gotten us anywhere, it's the fact that people like me who swore they would never see it ended up watching it on United Airlines. So there you go. Anyway, so on that note, Michael, please give us something good to recommend as we while away the weekend.
Well, speaking of absurd, one of my favorite shows is back in probably, I think, years too. Severance, back on Apple TV.
It's so funny. I was just talking about this because I had trouble getting through the first season of Severance. Like the pacing was a bit slow, but I'm suffering through it again because I hear the second season is so great.
I understand what you're saying. It was a little, you had to stick with it to understand where the show was going and what the sort of rules of it were and what the mystery is. But by the end, I think it all came together for me and I was excited to get season 2 back, which is after a long delay has started streaming on Apple TV with Adam Scott. And I got to say, I had a very Severance moment recently. I was in JFK at the airport lounge. I'm sitting there and I see this guy walking towards me. He's wearing a barber jacket and big black hair. I'm like, it's Adam Scott. And I thought, oh, is this his innie or his outie? I'm not sure. Which one is this? Who is he? I don't know how I should approach him, but I didn't approach him. But to see him out in the wild was kind of like one of those dissonant moments that you get in Severance, which, as you all know, the guy who's working, turns out he's got a separate world in the office and outside the office. But there's a lot I'm enjoying in the new season. I'm going to see where it goes, like you, but it's Severance and it's on Apple TV.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We wish you all a wonderful weekend. I wish I could say that it would be Trump-free, but alas, I'm afraid that this is the world we live in now. Michael, will you please read us out?
Absolutely. Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan, and our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.